series that our director right here, Marsha Nelson, conceived, and is a librarian at Yale and Rutgers and Cornell. So he was well-heeled, and he elected to become a librarian in his first career. I say he had two careers, one as a librarian, and then the other as a Smoky Mountain writer. Because after he got here to the Smokies in 1904, he stayed. He only left, I think, one time to go off to visit other parts of Appalachia to kind of get the feel of the Appalachian culture, and whether it was similar in North Carolina as it was in North Georgia, let's say. So he was a scholar. He wanted to learn about these people. He admired these mountaineers, even though he wasn't one of them. And most of them accepted him. He had his critics, of course, as an outsider who came in. But he made himself known for us today, principally because he wrote a couple of good books way back early in the 20th century. And the most famous one is our Southern Highlanders. Many of you have looked at it. This is a copy from our library. You can check it out. 1913 it was published. And it wasn't published in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Nashville, Tennessee. It was published in New York City, which was the literary capital of the nation at that time, probably still is. So it reached a pretty good audience. He never made a lot of money off of it, but it's a great read of the colorful life of the mountaineers that he met. Most of the stories are centered in North Carolina, over on the other side of the mountain, around, let's say Bryson City, Deep Creek, Hazel Creek. He loved Hazel Creek, he loved Deep Creek. But he lived in Bryson City, and he lived a Spartan life. He lived in just a one-room boarding house in the town. He wasn't an ostentatious guy. He wasn't looking for fame. But this book kind of put him on the map. But even before that book, even before this one, which was 1913, he had published this book, Camping and Woodcraft, or what was originally called the Book of Camping and Woodcraft, 1906. And if you haven't read this thing, it's not totally specific to the Smokies, but it is totally specific to the outdoor life. Because he was living in Missouri when he was the chief librarian at St. Louis Mercantile Library. He was traveling down into the Ozarks, camping, fishing, hunting, learning what he wanted to learn. He loved the outdoors. And this is a compilation of his work, 1906, New York City published also. And by the way, this book and this book are still in print today, 120 years or more after they were first published. I've written a couple of books, and I guarantee you, 100 years from now, they won't be around. They're not going to make it, sadly. They survived for about 20 years. So they're 20. My first little project was this book. That is in our library here, by the way. All of these are in our collections, Smoky Mountains. Even my little humble attempt. This is a book I put together called Old Smoky Mountain Days. And I have a section in there about the writings of Horace Kephart. Because he loved these people. Even as an outsider, he loved the mountaineers. He wrote about them. And interestingly enough, you know, we all know there's writers that come to the Smokies to write a book, many books. If you go to the library at Sugarland's Visitor Center, look at the books they got on the wall, many, many volumes. So we know people write books, but many of those writers who write these current books, they come in from university or private researchers, do their research for 3 months, maybe 4, come to your library, come to ours, go to the archives in the park, then go back to their home and write their books. And maybe never to be seen in these parts again, which is okay. What did Horace Kephart do? He came here, he didn't have a library to go to, he didn't have your library, didn't have ours, he didn't have the archives in the Smokies. He researched about living among the people, he wrote his books, and then he stayed. He stayed here 25 years after he got here. Got here in 1904. So he loved this area. If he didn't, he would have left. He would have said, I got my fame, I wrote these books, I got some ink, as we say in the trade, and I'm back to Chicago, or wherever. But he stayed with the Mountaineers. So that's another trait about this guy that I like. I think he was, indeed, a man of the woods. In fact, he loved the outdoors so much that he said this. This is one of his quotes. In the School of the Woods, there is no graduation day, which means you always are learning something about camping and woodcraft in the woods. During his there late life, Actually, that's up on Mount Kephart when they dedicated it. He went up there on a hike as an older man. And so that's a great quote. Here's another one I like that was in a banner at Cullowhee, North Carolina, which is at the university there, Western Carolina University, great school. And they hold the papers of Horace Kephart. They have all the papers, pretty much, that Horace Kephart left behind. The Pack Library in Asheville, North Carolina has some too. Pretty good collection. But look at that. First, here's a quote from his book, Camping and Woodcraft, this book here, which was 1906 his first big success. Just made him kind of be known in the trade. He said, first and above all, be playing in the woods. And that was his idea. You know, today you go into the park and I see these hikers and they got all kinds of gear, polypropylene and gaiters and these kind of hats and stuff, you know, just high tech. They got GPS to find the trails. You need GPS to find the trails. You're not reading the guidebooks, in my opinion. Unless it's a cloudy day, you're not going to get the satellites in anyway. I always see people hiking the trail with their GPS in it, and then they trip on a log that's in the trail. Okay, yeah. But anyway, he was totally committed to the outdoor life. And here is the people, these are the people who wrote that, this new bio that my friend Kayla has there. George Ellison up on top. And then down at the bottom, that's me over there. The other one, that's Libby Kephart, Hargrave, the great-granddaughter of Horace Kephart, who was a great person. I've hiked with her many a time. And then that other lady over on the left, that is Janet McHugh. We were on a trail, we were on Deep Creek Trail when we took this picture on a hike up to Kephart's summer camp around campsite number 57 on Deep Creek. A great hike. I've hiked with her several times. And she, by the way, Libby Kephart, in the middle, she has put out this great DVD. Did you have this? Y'all have
We
this?
did not. I thought we did, but I
Yeah,
didn't
I
get
think we
it
chatted
for our
about it.
next order.
Kayla here is from Anna Porter Library in Gatlinburg. And you have a very good Smoky Mountain collection too.
Yeah.
But this is something you can pick up. It's a great story about Kephart's life, told by his great granddaughter, Libby, who has followed, kind of become the, I guess, the chronicler of the heritage of Horace Kephart today. And she's done a great job. That's a well done. She has Ken Burns in here too, the guy, the great documentarian about the Civil War and baseball and all that. So Kephart, these are some important people in the story. There's Libby's DVD, well worth getting. And of course today, Great Smoky Mountain is not that wilderness that Horace Kephart met. In fact, when he got here, it really wasn't a wilderness because what was there when he got here in 1904? What was in the Smokies? Huh?
A lot of people,
People.
homes here.
People, residents, yeah. Glenn Cardwell, who many of us know, deceased, the gentleman, sadly, he was a great man. Grew up, he was born up Indian Creek in Greenbrier, and then went on to become a park ranger for 34 years at Sugar Land. He was a great man. Then he became the mayor of Pittman Center, so he was always involved in this area. He said, like you just mentioned, I asked him once, I said, Glenn, how many people were in the Smokies before it became a national park? He said, we don't know exactly, because when they bought the deeds, it just had the deed holder's name. It didn't say this deed holder has 10 kids or 2 kids. And so we don't know about the deeds. There were 6,600 deeds that had to be bought. So Glenn says probably 6,000 people were in the park that had to be removed. And we know that happened. The state of Tennessee came in, bought people out, 1920s and 30s. Some of your folks, yeah. Many of the residents around here, we still have a lot of the descendants of those early good folk that were living in the mountains before the national park. 6,000 people were bought out to make a national park. So I always do this. I'm going to take a moment and thank those people who had to leave, their families. They gave up a lot, didn't they, to have to leave their farms in Cadesco or Greenbrier or Cosby or Deep Creek, you name it. 6,000 folks had to be removed, and we should thank them for that, because that was a challenge, wasn't it? Yeah, indeed. A lot of angst there to do that. And they gave us now this park that is the most visited in the whole United States. 14.2 million came last year. A heck of a lot of people. And the year before that was 14 million. The year before that was 13 million. I remember looking at the records. I used to work in the park, and I remember I went and looked at 1950, the attendance or the visitation record that was on file in the library there. And it was over 1 million people by 1950, even by 1950. Started in 1934 as a park, national park. So we know it, millions of people come, and why not? Look at these views. Park has really brought out the wilderness again, sadly at the expense of our friends who had to leave in the earlier days. By the way, in addition to our mountaineers who had to leave, who else had to leave this area even prior to that? Even prior to the 30s? Indians, Cherokees, and others, yeah. So in this area, in historical fact, we've had 2 removals of people. The mountaineers in the 1920s, 30s, out of the Smokies, and even 100 years before that, 1838 or thereabout, and beyond. Hundreds of Cherokee Indians who had to leave too, so we honor their spirit, their life too. And Horace Kephart was indeed interested in the Cherokee. In fact, he even penned a smaller book that's in our collection in Washington. And very thanks to you and Julie for having such an emphasis on our past. Here's a little booklet, a book that he put out 1920s called The Cherokees of the Smoky Mountains. I'm gonna pass them around if you don't mind. That one is a very good, succinct history of the Cherokee Indians that Horace Kephart put together, because he was a student of those first mountaineers. They were really the first Smoky Mountaineers. We had the white settlers come in later. These are the original Smoky Mountaineers. So who wouldn't? That's what we have here: a heritage of recreation, scenic qualities. But that wasn't what was here when this guy got here. There's Horace Kephart with his German Luger pistol in his hand. And if you notice, I didn't put it in there. There's a rattlesnake tattooed his right on the right side of his hand there. You may have seen the picture. He was an outdoorsman. He certainly was an intellectual, a writer, and a librarian. But he was an outdoor guy. He wrote books and articles about the outdoors and about shooting, and hunting and fishing. He wrote a book called Sporting Firearms. I have a copy of that. And so that's when he came here. As I mentioned, his first success after he got here was to write this book, Book of Camping and Woodcraft. And we said he wrote our Southern Highlanders. Yes, very good copy there. And again, we have that, not that particular copy. It's been through several reprints over the years. But that's a classic, still in print today. And here's where he went into the Smokies. This is where Horace Kephart spent his first, as you can see, about a year and a half, November the 2nd of 1904 to January of 1906. He stayed on a little creek, a tributary of Hazel Creek on the southwestern side of the park. Hard to get to. You almost have to take that pontoon boat from Fontana Lake over to Hazel Creek. You can't walk it over there, but it's a long way. Anyway, that house is no longer there. I was in there with Libby Kephart when we talked about it, had done the DVD. About 4 years ago, we walked in there with about 20 or 30 other people. And you can find that place, but the cabin's gone. And that's where he put together, that's where he finished this book, Camping and Woodcraft, right in that cabin on the Little Fork of the Sugar Fork of Hazel Creek. And that's where he started the work on our Southern Highlanders. He pictured people, he took the lives of his neighbors on Hazel Creek and Eagle Creek, pretty much like this, and Deep Creek too. So he was a man of the woods. He certainly wasn't some effete Easterner who didn't know how to handle himself in the woods. Horace Kephart knew how to handle himself. He was born in September the 2nd, 1862 in East Salem, Pennsylvania. His father was a teacher and a religious man. So he was born in Pennsylvania. But when Horace Kephart was about 5 years old, the family moved out to Iowa, about 50 miles south of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So this is the environment of the days when Kephart was on the plains, rolling hills, grasslands of Iowa. And Kephart kind of grew up in that for the first 5 or 6 years of his life. And he said that one time he was looking out on the prairie from his house, because he was a single child, the only child of this couple. And his father would go off to work in Cedar Rapids for a week and come back. And his mother and him were at home And here's what Kephart says of a particular incident at that site on the prairies of Iowa. He says this: when I was in Iowa, it was before the day of fences, and for a year or so, there was little to be seen from our front door but a sea of grass waving to the horizon. Wild Indians often passed our house. And one time, had it not been for the timely arrival of my father, I, a little boy, would have killed with Dad's rifle a squaw who, with others, was robbing our house while her band stood agreeing at my mother's panic of fear. So Horace was ready to pull down the old shotgun off the mantelpiece and go shoot. That's the kind of guy he was. He was not a shrieking violet, but it shows that he grew up in a time of American history when it was still the frontier. His people were Swiss immigrants from Switzerland who had come to settle in central Pennsylvania about the middle part of the 18th century. And they were rural, so Kephart knew that his people were rural. And we'll see as I go through this talk, I hope I present, that Kephart always kind of went back to his rural heritage, even though he lived in very urban areas like St. Louis, lived at New Haven, Connecticut, lived in Cornell, New York. He had a rural upbringing, and it stayed with him, where in the latter part of his life, he really wanted to go back to the woods. He gave up this. Finally, the family went back to Pennsylvania. Kephart finished his studies in Pennsylvania, and then he goes, this little rural boy, about 18 years old, goes to Boston. He gets accepted to Boston University. Another world changes from his mother, who was primarily his original teacher. Now he's in Boston. He is going to get a general education because he's an intelligent guy. And at Boston, he learns that he loves libraries. This is where he becomes really a librarian. Boston is full of libraries, we know. All the various Harvard and Boston University and all the public libraries in the city. And he talked about his autobiographical piece that he wrote in 1922, that he loved these academic settings that he worked in because he could roam the stacks, just pick any title that appealed to him. Not only was he working on a degree, but he would also just vicariously look at anything that appealed to him, particularly about the outdoors. So he goes to Boston, he gets a library degree, and he gets a job as an assistant librarian at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And at Cornell, two people come into his life that will be important. One is his wife. This is his wife, Laura Mack, and some of their kids. She's a lady from Ithaca. They get betrothed to be married. But before they get married, before they get married, Kephart gets an offer to go to Italy. And here's a picture of him in Florence, Italy, in 1886. He was going to get married in 1886. But one of his former colleagues at Cornell University Library, in fact, one of the chief librarians, his wife had died, and he had inherited an inheritance. And he took off to take his books and live in Italy. And he had a sizable collection of books. In fact, he had one of the largest personal libraries in North America at that time, they say. And he was an authority, this friend of his, on the Italian poet Petrarch. And he also had an interest, that gentleman, in Finnish poet. So he was eclectic. I mean, who does Finnish poets? But this guy did. So Horace Kephart gets an offer. His buddy telegraphs him or sends him a letter and said, hey, why don't you come on over? I need help in cataloging my collection. I'm here alone with my mother. His wife had died. Said you can stay here. He had a villa in Florence. So Kephart took that up as a good opportunity to go see the world and get paid. This gentleman was going to pay and learn some more about collections of library resources. And there's a picture of him in Florence as a young man, 1886. He was born in 1862, so he's about 24 then. And he takes that advantage. He goes over there, and in his autobiographical piece, he says that he roamed, in addition to spending time at the villa, helping his friend catalog his sizable collection. He would go through the libraries in Florence. He started to learn Italian, obviously, to get used to the language and the culture. And he took up another trait in Italy, which served him well when he finally came south to the Smokies. He went hiking in the Alps and in the Appalachian Mountains on his own time. A skill that he would obviously use here when he came to the South. So here's where he went after he was at Cornell. He got a job at Yale University as an assistant librarian. Then he finally got the job that probably should have been his life's work and life calling. It probably should have been that we would have never heard it from him at all, because he became the chief librarian at the St. Louis Mercantile Library. They didn't have the arch back then. And here's St. Louis at about the 1890s when Horace gets there. He gets there in 1890, and here's his library. St. Louis Mercantile Library. He takes it over as the chief librarian. So the first several years there, he's just kind of upgrading. This is a subscription library where you have to pay to be a member, and then you can take out books. Subscription library. And he puts his stamp on this library. He brings it up to the standards that he thought were where it should be. He spends money on upgrading the collections. He's got the purse strings as the chief librarian. And he makes a mark for himself. He also, after the first several years, he gets there in 1890, by about 1895, 96, Horace Kephart decides he's going to have this place become the finest repository of Western Americana initial real journals of the pioneers, people who were on the Oregon Trail, people who were in the fur trade, people that were in the gold rushes in the 1840s on. And he did. He made this place become a repository of the finest Western Americana literature in the nation. Marcia, this should be appealing to you. This is a library card from his library. So St. Louis Mercantile Library, this is the number of, I guess, the checkout. It was November the 3rd, 1892. And read the following. This book may be kept out 2 weeks. Fine for detention beyond that time is 2 cents per day. We're only 10 cents a day, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're not gouging anybody. But look at the bottom. Look at this notice. Listen how tough this notice is here. Notice, any subscriber in whose possession this book shall be torn, written in, or otherwise damaged will be subject to a fine equal to 4 times the cost of the book. So if somebody loses the book, if it was a $20 book, they'd have to pay $80. Boy, that was tough, wasn't it? It was tough life back in those days. Librarians were not like us, sweet and loving. They were tough. Christina. I thought that was fun. Anyway, so Kephart moves to St. Louis. He becomes a family man. He does get married to Laura Mack. And they commence to have kids, as you can see here. I had 4 daughters and 2 boys. And when he left the library profession, when he went south to the mountains, when he left his wife, which he did, the daughters later in life always held it against him. His daughters really didn't like Dad. They thought he had abandoned Mama. And he probably had, let's be honest. His 2 sons, George and Leonard, actually got to where they, in their writings, liked their dad's image as the outdoorsman, because they were outdoorsmen too. Leonard became went to the United States Department of Agriculture as a horticulturalist. He went around the world studying plants in various countries, seeing that they had applications of use in the United States. And George, the young boy, the young little guy, he went off to work in the Indian Bureau, working with tribes. So they both kind of gravitated to an outdoor life, probably based on their dad being a sort of a person of note in that outdoor world. This is their happy little home in St. Louis, probably, let's say, 1890, late 1890, I think the last kids of 1898. Friendly, happy little house. He had a good career, you know. If you look back in the 1890s, this man was the epitome of success. Maybe not a millionaire, but he had a good job. He was the chief librarian at the St. Louis Mercantile Library. He had a good family. He had a nice little house downtown. But we see about the late 1890s, Horace Kephart starts to lose something, midlife crisis is what we might call it. Around about late 30s, when he is at his success as a librarian in the city of St. Louis and has everything going for him, at least on the surface, he starts to show a little restlessness. He starts to stay away from the family a little bit. He goes camping a lot. He ends up wanting to go into the Ozark Mountains south of St. Louis a lot, into Arkansas and into the lower part of Missouri. Because his interests are not so much in library science or the high culture of Florence, Italy anymore. It's American history and it's American frontier. And in his mind, the best way to experience the American frontier is not only to read about it, but to act it out, to become a camper. Hence, that's why he wrote that book, Camping in Woodcraft, about this time. But he had to add to his burden of problems, which he was experiencing at this time, of just restlessness, of not being happy where he was. Look at that awful disaster. This is not from St. Louis, that's Wellsville, New York, but it references in 1896, he'd been there 6 years. St. Louis is in the path of a monstrous cyclone. 1,000 people were killed. One of those people was almost Horace Kephart, because he was coming home from work. He walked back to his house. He got caught in that red zone, and in his autobiographical piece, he says he had to grab hold of a lamppost to save himself from being swept away and killed in the middle of this awful cyclone that went right through downtown. There's the Mississippi River down the bottom. So this shook his nerves. It didn't help him any. But look at this picture from the Missouri Historical Museum. Hundreds of people would gather outside the morgue as the fatalities were processed through the morgue. It was a terrible event, and he was right in the middle of it, which was strange. Well, it affected his work. He started to drink about that time, about the 1890s. He's spending more time away from home. He's going out in the woods, and he actually is drinking too much. I guess from the pressures of what he thought were his life's troubles. When on the surface, he had everything going for him. It's surprising he did this. There's his library. His board of directors, he started to miss days at work because he would go camping. And so his board of directors finally got tired of this stuff and warned him that, we want you to be more on site, take care of the financial doings of this institution, and be here. 90% of life is being there, and he wasn't. So he gets in trouble there, and he has a nervous breakdown, and he ultimately gets fired from his job. His wife leaves him because they have no income. They never divorced, but she left him, took the kids and herself back up to her home in Ithaca, New York. And Horace Kephart was left to have his dad come pick him up in St. Louis, take him up to Dayton, Ohio for about 3 months, where he recovered somewhat. And then Horace Kephart decided, shortly thereafter, about 6 months after this incident of being fired, and his wife leaving him, he heads to Asheville, North Carolina on a train, summer of 1904. And he is on a mission to come into the southern Appalachian Mountains and explore what he thought was an area of people that resembled the pioneers that he was so fascinated about. And he also thought in the southern Appalachian Mountains, he could see in the people who were here what his ancestors had to face in the frontier in Pennsylvania. So again, he's going back. Everything he's doing now is referencing his family tradition. Instead of being a city guy wearing a tie going to work, he wanted to be in the woods now. He didn't want that life anymore. He didn't like the big city. In fact, he had a quote. He said, "To a city man, the affairs of the city can wear you down," which means that's indicative of his life. And he also wrote a quote in a book, a small book that he had called "The Joys of Barbarism," of all things. He said, I like the woods in the front of the mountains because there are no shams in them. And we see here a really antisocial kind of behavior, where he's wanting to get away from people, go to the mountains. So his first stop is the Southern Railway Depot in Asheville. It's a great building, and it's no longer there. Nice sort of, I guess you'd call it Mediterranean side. But he gets into Asheville. He takes a room in town. There's what Asheville probably looked like. That is Asheville, about the 1890s. He goes see a doctor, and he stays in the city for about 2 weeks. He's still shook up. He had a nervous breakdown, apparently, in St. Louis. The doctor told him, well, you really don't need to be doing that outdoor life for a while, because he had told his doctor, I want to explore the mountains. And the doctor told him, well, there's really no trails, there's no roads if you go over the mountains. This is 1903. Kephart does, after about 2 weeks in the city, he takes a train from Asheville down to Murphy, North Carolina, on the old Murphy line. And then he comes back up and he goes into the Bryson City area. Then he gets a train that goes out to today, right along the edge of, which would be today, Fontana Lake, to a little town called Bushnell, which is no longer there. It's under Lake Fontana. And he learns there are people up there, and he learns they're living a life that seems to appeal to him, and he decides to go there. He gets another train goes up to Dillsboro, and he stays there a while in a tent just like this. Dillsboro, North Carolina, right, not too far from the mountains, not too far from Cherokee. Spends a couple of months camped out along Tuckasegee River, learning and practicing his outdoor ways. Then he finally learns from that this man here, down the left, is a businessman and a postmaster of a little town in the off what is today Lake Fontaine. And this guy's name is Granville Calhoun. And Granville Calhoun talks to Horace Kephart, because Kephart is going around town in Dillsboro asking, is there any place I can stay in the mountains for a while? Anybody got any cabins I can stay? Granville Calhoun got up with him and said, well, there is an old abandoned cabin that was used as a mining cabin, a caretaker's cabin. We saw the picture a while ago. So Kephart takes that advantage and spends, again, the next couple of years in that cabin right there that we saw earlier. And this is the environment of the little community of Medlin around him. These are notes from his own photographs, but this is his writing. Medlin, North Carolina, not much, it's no longer there, it's on the trail, on Hazel Creek Trail today. There is Calhoun's store. Granville Calhoun had a country store there, and Kephart would spend the time there. He'd also use, there was a post office in Medlin that Horace Kephart could send his manuscripts on his projects through the mails from Medlin Post Office to New York City. Now that's a stretch, and all the way from Medlin, sending your draft and your manuscripts, and then having people in New York City read it and finally say, yeah, we like it, and publish this. So he felt probably really vindicated when that book was published, because he was away from it here. He was out of the loop, if you might say. But this is where he wanted to be. This is the lifestyle he wanted. There's a view from his cabin where he wrote this book. That's his view for about a year and a half in the mountains, learning the ways of the woods. This is a picture of him at that cabin, about 1904, thereabouts. Notice the weapons on the wall, pistols on the wall, maybe even a jug of something down on the bottom there. I don't know what that is. I think I do. And he was learning and practicing the life that he wanted, living with the mountaineers. This is a colorful guy that he mentions in our Southern Highlanders called Quill Rose, very colorful man who lived over there on the Eagle Creek area of North Carolina, which is today in Sapper Park, and his family. Look at the looks on their faces. No smiles. It's a tough life, these mountaineers, you know. They're not really gaffing it up, are they? Quill doesn't look too happy himself. But this is a picture Kephart made. Kephart's photo albums, as you see off to the right, those are his actual prints with notes. They're in the collection at the Western Carolina University Archives. They're the repositories of much of the affairs and writings of Horace Kephart. And this is Quill Rose's grave. It's not too far from here. It's in Townsend, Tennessee, at the Tuckaleechee United Methodist Church. I found out where Quill Rose was buried, and you can go see it tomorrow. It's in that church cemetery. And notice what's interesting about this guy.
Confederate.
Huh?
Confederate.
Yes. And what unit? Thomas's Legion. We have a book at Washington. Julie have acquired this from our Smoky Mountain collection, which is a history of Thomas's Confederate Legion, a very interesting Confederate, as you said, Confederate unit. It was a legion, which meant it had artillery, infantry, and cavalry, which there weren't many of those. In fact, this is a great book. It's in our collection, Smoky Mountain collection. It's a great book, written by, put out by the Cherokee, Museum of the Cherokee Indian Publishing House in Cherokee, North Carolina. You can find that grave. I'm an admirer of Quill. There I am, kind of sodden. I just got off a trail where I got soaked to the bone by a late afternoon thunderstorm, and I was wet. I'll tell you about it. But that's his grave. Over on the Tennessee side, even though when Horace Kephart done, he was over there in the area of Hazel Creek. Wasn't too far. If you look at where that, if you go from Townsend over the mountains, you'll come into Hazel Creek within about 30 miles. It's not that far. So Horace Kephart lived this life. He loved to be in the outdoors. There's his buddy there on the left. He used to love to be in the mountain hunting. Bear hunting. That's an actual picture of Kephart took of a bear hunt. There were dogs and the gentleman. Granville Calhoun is up front there, his buddy. Kephart's a mountain man. He is learning. And he's very complimentary to these people. He's not looking down on them. He's not degrading to these mountaineers. That's another one of his traits. He really didn't make judgments about them. The rest of the world might have said the people in Hazel Creek or perhaps anywhere over here were backward. How many writers in the early 1920s said Appalachia is backward and looked down on it? Not Kephart. He wrote also this book while he was in this period of time on the mountains. This is a small publication, and I can tell you the price on the bottom is 25 cents. And I have this, I got that myself for my collection. So Kephart was an absolute genius of the mountain trail at that particular time. Boy Scouts of America, in the period of time of the 1920s, adopted camping and woodcraft as one of their manuals. The United States Infantry adopted camping and woodcraft as one of their training manuals. That's how important it was. So finally, though, Kephart leaves that mountain hamlet of Hazel Creek. And he has to find himself, he's known now, he's got books published, he's got to be available to go to New York to his publishers. And he moves to a little town called Bryson City. Neat little town today. I'm sure all of us pretty much have been there. It's a great little town. Hadn't really lost too much of its flavor as a mountain hamlet. And he gets a boarding house, a room there, and then he gets an office here on Everett Street. This is Bennett's Drug building right in the middle today. That's what it looked like. Of course, Kephart would go through that building, through the door, walk down above those storefronts, and his office on the very end down there, right on the Tuckasegee River. And that's where, for the next 25 years, he would do his writing. And he made a lot of money not only by just writing books, he did a lot of reviews for American Rifleman and Sports Afield on guns and bullets and outdoor equipment. That's how he made his money. He did tests and wrote articles about it, just like you might see today in a sporting magazine that we see in the magazine racks like Sports Afield. But that's Bryson City became his home. Some of you may know that not far from there is this road to nowhere where there's going to be a North Shore road into the park where the cemetery, people get access to their cemeteries. The TVA flooded Fontana and it blocked that access. If you go into town today, they still have this sign up, which is a broken promise from TVA. The residents in Swain County, still to this day, probably rightly so, think they were cheated out of a chance to be able to see their cemeteries in the park, even though they've received millions of dollars in compensation. I thought that's an interesting sign. It's still up there today, not far from the high school. While Kephart is in Bryson City, he writes this book, which is sort of a corollary to camping and woodcraft, Camp Cookery. You can see that's the Outing Publishing Company rendition or publication. They use that style quite a lot of his. Here's one of his sporting firearms. Again, he's a bullet guy. He's a hunter. He's a mountain man. You know, he's a city guy. You know, he also wrote books that were sort of edited on other books, like First to the Great Canyon, a treatise on John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran, who is a man who, in his party, was the first to run boats down the Colorado River in today's Grand Canyon National Park. Guns, ammunition, and tackle. That's Horace Kephart's life now. A mountain rider, an outdoor rider, living in Bryson City, not living in Seattle, not living in Nashville or Memphis or any of the other places, not living in New York City, but in Bryson City, North Carolina. Still in touch with the mountain people whom he loved. There's his little autobiographical piece. You can find this. I have several copies. North Carolina Library Bulletin, June of 1922. And this is where a lot of the writers like George Ellison and others who've written a lot of good stuff many years on now got most of their original information and he told them where to go to. Like go to, let's say, the universities to find out where Kephart's records are. Kephart was, again, as I said, a outdoorsman. This is how he made his money. He would get money for articles, just like a lot of other writers did. He wrote for Outdoor Life, Sports Afield. There's that book we just sent around on the Cherokees and Smoky Mountains. He was a student of the mountains, and particularly the Cherokees and the White Mountaineers. That copy over there on the left, this is the newer version that I think University of Tennessee published. That one is a copy I have of my collection, and I got it at Sugarland's Visitor Center way back in the 70s. I think I paid 75 cents for it. It's not an original, but it still is rather rustic in its publication and appearance. Kephart loved the mountaineers, he loved the Indians, the Cherokees, he thought them being a people of the mountains. This is, looks like it's a condescending photo. That's Kephart on the left, later in life. It looks like he's maybe making fun of these outfits, but he isn't. This gentleman over here was a doctor with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. So Kephart met him, and that gentleman said, let's try out some of my collection of real headdresses and real Indian clothing. So Kephart did that. He's not really mocking it. He's, I think, enjoying it and reveling in it. So Kephart also, all his life, had, in addition to Mountaineers' love, a love for the life of the first Americans and the first Mountaineers. Kephart also had an interest in this subject. You probably already know what it is.
Still.
Moonshining. Something that came from our Scottish, our ancestors. They just say, Irish and Scots. They brought that over with them, along with this Appalachian music and dancing and fiddle tunes and jigs and reels. You know, we get that stuff from the old world, particularly Ireland, Scotland, Wales, a little bit from England. So Kephart was fascinated by this, and he wrote about it. There's a subject, a chapter in his book about the Mountaineers and their distilling of liquor. You know, we're not promoting it, obviously. It's not good for you. But it was a part of the Mountaineers, and we all know that. And Kephart even befriended this gentleman here, you'll see with the pistol over there, a gentleman who was a Bureau of Indian Affairs detective. He'd come into Cherokee to roust out some of the Cherokees who were making booze, and he arrested a bunch of them. And his name was J.R. Thomason. Kephart has a chapter in his book, Our Southern Highlanders, about this guy, and it's a really interesting chapter. If you don't read anything else, read about the moonshiners in the mountains, and particularly this one guy who was a fast draw. Kephart admired him because he was a killer fast draw. They went shooting out in the woods. Kephart liked this guy quite a bit. We called him the snake stick man because he would make sticks, carved sticks, and give them to the Cherokees as sort of a bribe. Like, well, I'll give you that stick, but who do you know around here makes whiskey? So Kephart kind of thought he was being used by this federal agent because he was getting information from Kephart about some of the Mountaineers. He confronted this guy, and the guy even told him, said, yeah, he said, I did get information from you, but I never lied. I didn't tell you I didn't say anything that was contradictory. You could have said no. I didn't force you to say it, and that's my job, to interview people, get materials, and then act on it. So J.R. Thomason, the snake stick man, a great character in the book. So in his latter years, Horace Kephart sometimes would get tired of even the small town atmosphere of Bryson City, North Carolina, which you would think would never irritate anybody because there's no city atmosphere to it. But Kephart would, during the summer months, for the last 10 years of his life at least, he would go up 10 miles up the Deep Creek area. It wasn't a trail then because it wasn't a national park. Up to a place called the Bryson Place. And today it's campsite 57 on the Smoky Mountain map. And there's his desk. He would camp out along the tributary of Deep Creek. He would do his testing of his firearms, testing of fishing equipment. Right then, he's there sitting writing notes, write his articles, then get a bevy of those articles, go back into town, mail them to his publishers, then wait for a check to come. That's his life, spending time in the mountains. During the winters, he was in Bryson City, summertime up here at Bryson Place, and doing what he wanted to do. Fascinating job. Again, there's his office. He had a house over here, or his boarding house, is about this way, about 400 or 500 yards, and the old Cooper house, which is no longer there. Bryson City became his focal point. And during this period, he also wrote this book here, late in life. This would have been about 1929. He died in 31, so a couple years before he died. He wrote this book, or this manuscript, and it never got published. He sent it to some of his publishers, but they said, you're not a fiction writer. You're non-fiction. You're a guy with guns and outdoor equipment. You don't want a story of romance in the Smoky Mountains up Deep Creek. So it never got published. This thing never got published. In fact, my wife and I went up to Western Carolina University 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and we found the manuscript of this, and it was incomplete. It really wasn't finished. And George Ellison, the guy who wrote this biography, he wrote early, he's on record in the 1970s saying, because he had read the manuscript, that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth publishing. Well, Lily Kephart Hargrave, the great-granddaughter, found a complete copy in the family files, and she sent it to the Great Smoky Mountain Association at the park. With a little bit of cleaning up, a little editing, they published it in 2009, finally. It was written in 1928, 29. By 2009, it finally got published, and we have it here in our collection as the one and only fiction book that Horace Kephart ever wrote, and finally got published. Never saw it come to fruition. Pretty good read. It's not, you know, it's not Ernest Hemingway, but it's okay. So we have that here in our collection. Yeah. So we got it all. So that's his sort of bibliography. A number of good works throughout his life. He was famous enough that he even had this. In the 1920s, this company out of Pennsylvania, Kephart was so well known as an outdoorsman that they fashioned this company a knife in his name, because it was one he used. He had the prototype, and he got a local blacksmith to make. And you can still buy this thing. It's still out there today. It's rather expensive. It's $200-something. But Cole Brothers said, look, it was designed by that well-known practical hunter Horace Kephart. This is 1920. So his reputation in the field of outdoors was legion. It really was. I had a chance to see that original knife at Horace Kephart days that Liddy Kephart put on. This was 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. And the university, the people from Western Carolina, that's from their collection. They brought it as a display. And I'll fess up, I touched it when you're not supposed to. But you put your finger oil on it. Don't report me. But I was, as you see, I was happy as a kid in a candy store there because I touched the legendary Horace Kephart's original knife that was within his affairs when he died. Yeah. So I fess up. When I do things wrong, I fess up. That one is not in our collection, but it's a great bit. So Kephart wasn't just an old mountaineer. He dressed up. This was on his way to New York for one of his publishers. He's on a train. He had his suit. He was a smoker, as you can see. He loved his pipe and his cigarettes. There's another dapper-looking guy late in his life. He died at 68, so this was probably a year or two before he died. He became an alderman in the city of Bryson City. He was on the North Carolina Forestry Commission. He worked with George Massa, the person we were talking about, a Japanese photographer who said he had met in Asheville, and they would work together on the nomenclature committee for the park, trying to decide names for unnamed places in the park, or where there were two names. Like over here in the park, we have Mount Cameron today. Some people call it White Top Mountain. Some people call it Sharp Place. It's got two different names in the local community zone, North Carolina, Tennessee. Park Service decided they were going to make a kind of a neutral name, so they call it Mount Cameron today. I like the name myself. But Kephart was a man of town, but he saw this happening in the area. As we all know, in the Smoky, we had logging in the early 1900s, 1920s. About a dozen lumber companies plied their trade. In our area of the country over here, the Little River Railroad and lumber company took out over 1 billion board feet of timber. That's what they estimate. And of course, that business is utilitarian. It does leave scars. But these two people out of Knoxville, Tennessee, Mr. and Mrs. Willis P. Davis, are credited with the idea for a national park, particularly Mrs. Davis. They'd gone out west. They were wealthy people in Knoxville. Mrs. Davis and he had gone out to Yellowstone on the train, and they came back fervently believing that there could be a national park in the Smokies here, because they saw where people out west had hotels in the park. People had trains coming to the park. People were selling souvenirs in the park. There were restaurants in the park. And this was Appalachia, in the 1920s, that we didn't have the kind of economic base we have today. So they proposed a national park in the Smokies. This guy here, Colonel David Chapman, have you ever been to Knoxville on Chapman Highway? It's named after this guy, a retail druggist or wholesale druggist in Knoxville, another well-heeled man who also had a cabin in Elkmont. This gentleman had a place, you know that. And a nice guy, this guy here put his whole reputation on the line to get a national park established. He really did go out on a limb saying that I'm going to make this national park. He had the friend of the governor at that time, Austin Peay. This is Carlos Campbell. There's a Carlos Campbell overlook as you go up the Smoky Mountains, up the Newfound Gap Road. He worked for the Knoxville Chamber of Commerce. He got so inspired with the idea for a national park himself, he ultimately almost lost his job because he was spending so much time on the park issue. This is Charles Webb, the Asheville, North Carolina newspaper, who also became a proponent of a national park in the Smokies. And their whole goal was what? What do you think these people thought about a national park? Gave you a little bit of the answer in the Davis's philosophy. Well, what was the original intent of these promoters? Conservation? He went like this. Yeah, economic development for this area. All these good capitalists, good guys and good women, who are well-heeled, were thinking, man, this place can become something. We can make money. We can have tourists. Boy, did they succeed? They did. That idea took a root and grew. Conservation was part of it, obviously, because by having a park, the scars of the timber industry would have been obliterated. Look at the park today. If you go right through the park and you're just a person from North Dakota, you say, God, there's never been anybody in here. It's wow. Well, 3/4 of the park had been logged in the past. That's how verdant nature will be. If you give it about 80 years, nature will come back. So Charles Webb was a proponent. This is our buddy George Massa. Masahara Azuka is his real name. Like you said, what's your name, sir? Mr.
Steve.
Steve said, he commented about this guy when we were just getting ready to go. Not many people know how this guy showed up in Asheville, North Carolina in 1950. He was from Okinawa. He's a great photographer. He's somewhat called the Ansel Adams of the Smokies, did great work. But he never talked about where he's from. He and Kephart became friends because they were working on the idea for a national park. Kephart would write things, and Massa would go into the woods, deep in the woods. He loved being out in the depths of the mountains. There he is with his tripod and his large format camera. This is Kephart over here. Here's Mr. Massa. In fact, one commentator was in the woods one day, one of the mountaineers, and they saw George Massa. And Massa would have he would measure trails with this rolling kind of wheel that clocked mileage. It was sort of a rustic clocker, but he get an idea. And he wore that bandana. So here's this Japanese gentleman coming down the trail in the middle of Appalachian, solo by himself, clicking off his little roller, and the locals would look at him and say, "What in the heck? What is this?" So he certainly was an interesting fellow. He was buried, as we said, in Riverside Cemetery in Asheville. This is a book that Kephart and Massa put together promoting a national park. The photos are from Massa, text is from Kephart, and that's put out by guess who? Chamber of Commerce in Swain County and Bryson City. There was a lot of support for the park, but interestingly enough, Kephart particularly was a fan of the people. We said that. He loved the mountaineers. So it's kind of ironic that he joined in on a movement that was going to get rid of the people. It's kind of the only irony about his philosophy was he wrote about the mountaineers, loved their lifestyle, but in the end, he supported a movement that moved them all out. This is sort of getting to the end. I want to show a name here of a gentleman who was another adventure writer, Fizzwood Tarleton, right there. Fizzwood Tarleton was a guy from Kentucky. He was a younger man. He wrote mostly about Kentucky and the dark and bloody ground of Daniel Boone, overland trails through Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground. And you notice, this is 1926, about the time Kephart is at his prime. He comes up from Georgia, Fizzwood Tarleton, to see the master, to see Horace Kephart. There's another of Fizzwood Tarleton's references here on these outdoor magazines. He was a kindred spirit to Horace Kephart, the outdoor life, making his living off writing. He comes up to visit Horace Kephart, and Kephart showed him around that area. They went hunting and fishing, stayed out in the mountains, went up Deep Creek, and they also one night on April the 2nd, 1931, were in Bryson City, and they wanted to get a drink. Sad story. Kephart did have a little problem. They had to go into the Cherokee Indian Reservation, the Qualla boundary, on that night, because Kephart knew a bootlegger. Remember, that's the what do you call it? What was it we called no booze? Prohibition. Thank you. So they were sneaking into their bootlegger of choice, and they apparently bought some of that product there, perhaps even sampled it, I suspect. And on the way back, they hired a driver, a guy named Mr. Brown, who really wasn't a taxi driver, he just had a car, and you'd say, hey, take me into Bryson City, or take me to Cherokee. And they are on their way back, and at this Gila Drive in Sandlin right here, it's on Cooper Creek, there's a turn in the road, and it's night. The driver does not make the curve, and he slams into the embankment of the creek. And Horace Kephart and his outdoor friend, Fiswood Tarleton, there it is, Gila Road and Cooper Creek. You can find this place today. That's where the accident took place. Horace Kephart was killed. As you notice from the statement down below, look, Kephart thrown 40 feet clear of car in crash. 68 years old. The other gentleman, Mr. Tarleton, died also. Noted author is dead. This is the Asheville newspapers the day afterwards. R.P. Brown, the taxi driver, in hospital with fractured skull. He survived, and according to one writer, he was killed a year later in a similar incident, coming back from a bootleg. Well, they buried Horace Kephart in, today it's called the Bryson City Cemetery, and it's an imposing, nice monument to the gentleman. And I think you guys have been there, right? Anybody else been there? It's right up on a hill, yep, out of Bryson City, up on top of a hill. And it's a moving place. It's a big stone. He's got a nice plaque there that his friends made for him, and I'll get a close-up of it. Horace Kephart, 62 to 31. Scholar, author, outdoorsman. He loved his neighbors and pictured them in Our Southern Highlanders, the books we have here. His vision helped to create the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Fitting monument to this guy. Kephart wanted to be buried along with his wife here, and also George Massey married him, as you mentioned. And he wanted to be buried in the park. He wanted to be buried inside Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Park Service wouldn't allow that. He wasn't a resident. There's my wife and one of our three-legged dogs. We've been known to collect some interesting dogs. We're dog lovers. That's what dog I got up that had an injured leg one day, and I saw it on the side of the road, and I took it, and we had to take the leg off at UT in Knoxville. But I even took her over there to see Horace Kephart's grave. That's my wife, about several years ago. But we're still married. He hasn't got rid of me yet. And if you notice, there's FT on the base of that stone, and that's Fiswood Tarleton, the guy that was with him that night. Had a wife in Georgia, but apparently he didn't have the money to be shipped back down to Georgia. So they found that the person who owned this plot said, we'll bury him here, and maybe later we can exhume him and send him elsewhere. He's still there. You can see 1931, he was about, 40 years old, 41 years of age. And the Boy Scouts, the Bryson City chapter, let's see, that was April the 2nd. By May, the next month, they put up this monument on Deep Creek to Horace Kephart, because again, Kephart was, his books were used by the Boy Scouts before they came out with their own publications. And I'll show you the close-up on that. But on this one, this is up on Deep Creek, up on Deep Creek Trail, about 10 miles from Bryson City, and it's on site number 57 today, a horse campsite. It said on this spot, Horace Kephart, the dean of American campers, and one of the principal founders of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, pitched his last permanent camp. And you can see it was put up by the Boy Scout troop, Horace Kephart troop, Boy Scouts of America. Kephart really was known, not only in our area, but all around as, again, the dean of American campers. This is a monument right downtown Bryson City at the junction of Spring and Main Street, put up by the North Carolina Historical Commission. And you can see author of Our Southern Highlanders and other works, naturalist librarian, and they point, there's a pointing up to the grave. And Mount Kephart, the ninth highest mountain in the park, is named after him now, and a creek called Kephart Prong, and a backcountry shelter called Kephart Prong Shelter. And so he's memorialized in certain places around the park, in addition to being in Bryson City. There's Mount Kephart. You can see it from Newfound Gap area, on the road, out there on Thomas Divide. Kephart's Mountains up there. If you've ever been to the jump off, anybody been out to the jump off? You guys have, I'm sure. Y'all been to the jump off? You have, yeah. That's Mount Kephart. That's the very peak of Mount Kephart. On the backside, you just drops back down into Greenbrier precipitous. So the park does honor Horace Kephart. We've got, as you see, there's Kephart Shelter. This is the Newfound Gap Road right here, going back up. There's Newfound Gap. Cherokee's down here. Kephart Shelter and Kephart Prom are duly noted in that park along with these marks. There's the shelter. Stayed there a number of times. So Kephart indeed got what he wanted, I think, in the idea that his life, he justified, I think, his life that he did some things in the mountains. At the expense of, let's be fair, his wife and family. I think he felt guilty about that all his life. Maybe that's what drove him to drink, I think. He felt guilty, I think, many a times. Just couldn't go back to the city. He just couldn't go back to the city. I think that's what it was. Even though he knew it was the right thing. They never divorced his wife. She came to his funeral in Bryson City. But this lady here and her husband John, that's Libby Kephart Hargrave and John Hargrave. They're keeping the idea of the Smokies and I should say Horace Kephart alive with that DVD with Horace Kephart days. If you want a good video, pick this up. You get it at the Smokies. I don't know if we have it here or not. I don't know. Can't remember. It's very good. And another thing I'll leave you with is that we were chatting about it. There's a great DVD documentary on George Massa that the North Carolina Humanities Department put out or commissioned. It's called The Mystery of George Massa. It really is well done. You can get it at the Smokies. And I don't know if we have it either, Marcia. I don't think so since it's North Carolina. But there's Kephart as he actually, in 1928, 1929, a couple years before he died, he was up on top of the mountain at the dedication of Mount Kephart. So he got to see, he was one of those few people that had a mountain named after him before he died. I think the only, Colonel David Chapman in the park is the only two people that have that honor to get a mountain named after you by the federal government before you die. You've got to have done something. Got to have done something to get that. So anyway, there's Deep Creek. Always when I drive over to North Carolina to Bryson City, you can go over the mountain. Right after Newfound Gap, you get a long ridge called Thomas Divide. And you pull over some of those overlooks and look down into Deep Creek. This is Deep Creek. It's 10 miles from there back to his camp. Downhill pretty much, but still rugged. And I always look at that and say, Kephart Country. That is Kephart Country. Deep Creek in the North Carolina side of the park. Anyway, I appreciate y'all listening to that show tonight. I know it's long, but Kephart is worthy of our study. He wasn't perfect. He's not a poster child for the American father or any other type of family award, but he did live the life he wanted, and he gave us something, and he worked for the establishment of the park. So thank y'all for listening, and remember, all these materials are here. All this material is right over there and here. Thanks to Marcia, Julie, and all the good people here that have preceded me. Thank y'all for listening.